to me, it's not about supporting Biden in the sense of liking him, of thinking, oh, I'm gonna give him the honor of my vote. The question is the equivalent of, do I want somebody to run after me waving a knife, or do I want somebody to run after me shooting a gun? Yeah, I know about the knife, but I would still prefer the knife scenario to the gun scenario. And ultimately, what it does is it gives us a little bit of breathing room with which we can build something better.
Okay, so I'll give a quick introduction. We are going to be talking about the topic, should the left support Joe Biden, specifically in swing states, and both of you are taking opposite stances on this topic. How we're going to go is we're going to do 5-minute opening statements, and you can obviously tell me at any point if you want to forego the rest of your time. We'll do a 20-minute open back and forth between the two of you. You're both professionals in your arenas, so I don't think I will need to do any moderating, but if things get a little too spicy, I might just try and redirect things back to the topics at hand. But otherwise, after that, we'll leave it open to some questions from the audience that can be directed to either of you, and then we'll close with 5-minute closing statements. Does that sound fair?
Sounds great.
Sure.
All right. So Ben, you proposed this debate, so I was thinking maybe you could open. That way Niko can have the final word at the very end.
Mm-hmm. That works for me.
Okay. All right. Well,
okay.
We will start with 5 minutes on the clock now.
All right. So first, I want to be clear about what I'm not arguing here. I'm not a progressives for Biden guy. I'm not going to tell you some story that soft pedals how bad Biden is in a, well, he's not perfect, but sort of way. I'm a socialist. The telos of my politics is organizing the working class majority of society, first to achieve important reforms like Medicare for All and Green New Deal, and long-term to reorganize society in a radically more democratic way by extending democracy to the workplace. And I'm very well aware that Joe Biden is, like Donald Trump, a representative of the ruling class that we are fighting against in those efforts. He's not an imperfect friend. He is an enemy. The political agenda that I support isn't on the ballot. That was Bernie Sanders, tried very hard to get him nominated. We lost. So we don't have that option of the agenda that we support being at least a realistic possibility to get more than a couple percent of the vote. What we have instead, and at least if we care about the outcome and not just making a statement, is a choice between two enemies. But here's the thing. Even though Trump and Biden are both enemies, they're both representatives of the ruling class, they embody very different strategies for managing the system on behalf of that ruling class. And those differences matter. They don't just even matter in terms of harm reduction. They matter strategically. So we can and should make a rational choice about which enemy we want to spend the next 4 years fighting and about which issues. I'm not pessimistic enough to believe that if Trump is reelected, Jacobin and the Serfs Twitch channel are going to be shut down. We'll all be sent to concentration camps. I'm not optimistic enough to believe that Biden can be pressured to support important reforms. I don't think either of those things are going to happen. But even though I don't think that getting rid of Trump by electing Biden is going to be any sort of step in the direction of American social democracy, what I think it absolutely is a necessary defensive maneuver to protect what little working class organization currently exists while we regroup and build the kind of political alternative that we so desperately need. Some people might think that we can build that alternative by voting third party in elections like this one, but we know that's not how it works. No electorally viable third party in any country with a system remotely like the United States has ever come about via any process like Jill Stein's 2%, becoming Holly Hawkins' 3%, becoming until finally some future third-party candidate wins an election. That's not how it works. If we ever are lucky enough to get an electorally viable third party in the United States, it's going to come about the way that Abraham Lincoln's Republican Party emerged from the decomposition of the Whigs, the anti-slavery wing of that becoming the Republicans by some organic process coming out of one of the existing parties. That's not going to come about by a third party. So what we have to think about is how we can build the kind of movement that could either, depending on how you see the end game of this, take over the Democrats, whatever that means, or by that kind of dirty break scenario, become a new party. Either way, I think that's building up the kind of electoral forces that coalesced around Bernie Sanders. And crucially, I think it's rebuilding the labor movement. I know I'm almost out of time here, but just let me make this last point really quickly. Because without an organized working class at its base, left politics is just shouting into the wind, and Donald Trump is an existential threat to what little still remains of organized labor in the United States. Look at the differences between Obama's appointees to the National Labor Relations Board and Trump's. Trump's are on a crusade to stamp out what collective bargaining exists in American workplaces. I think if we're going to have a chance of regrouping and going forward, creating something new, creating something that could actually politically defeat centrists, it is vitally important that we have as much working class organization as we possibly can, which is why I think that the enemy we want to spend the next 4 years fighting is the one that might try to co-opt and undermine the organized working class in various ways, but isn't just going to try to flat out stamp out what unions still exist in the way that Trump's appointees to the courts and the NLRB have been and will continue to do. So I like Howie Hawkins. I admire him. I wish he could actually be president. And if I lived in California, then I would, with a song in my heart, I would do the political equivalent of smearing some shit on my prison cell walls by voting for him, by making that statement. But because I don't, because I live in Michigan, I've done what I would urge other people to do, which is to make a reasonable strategic choice about which enemy you want to face.
All right, Niko, on to you. 5 minutes.
So even though I agree with you about, the way that we progress in this country is by organized labor, but the key that you brought up is the ability to fight the enemy that we choose. And the difference between Donald Trump and Biden is actually being allowed to fight the enemy. And that is what we're not going to get if we get Joe Biden. I mean, even as we speak, leftists are giving up leverage every single day. The article comes out that Joe Biden is literally interviewing neocons for his administration, despite the task force that he created whenever Bernie dropped out, that everybody was so excited about. And yet myself and a few others were like, I don't know why you're excited about this. We're not going to get into the administration. And that's exactly what's showing up. Bernie Sanders has not been interviewed. AOC has not been interviewed. Ilhan Omar, Pramila Jayapal, all the like have not been interviewed. And yet this seems to have fallen on deaf ears and people pretend like they haven't seen what they've seen with their own eyes. And on the cusp of that news that we receive, AOC does a record-breaking get out the vote effort in order to get a rapist, segregationist, warmonger, sex pest elected with literally zero leverage. And despite Biden and the Democrats really having everything to lose, they still refuse to give you anything. And then, of course, it goes to what we're allowed to discuss, because if you bring this up, then you're immediately attacked by the left. I mean, not to mention being attacked by neoliberals, but immediately being attacked by the left. If you're Chris Pratt, for example, just by not going to a Joe Biden, Kamala Harris fundraiser, you're immediately labeled a white supremacist, despite his clear history of almost exclusively donating to Democrats, like almost exclusively. And yet now he's a white supremacist because he wouldn't attend a Joe Biden fundraiser. When you're talking about Libya, because we're talking about, we would rather have somebody co-op, right? How about the first Black president who happened to be African being the reason that there is literal slave labor in Libya now, open market slavery in Libya under him, which barely anyone knows about because it was Obama? Or the fact that a young woman got her eye shot out at Standing Rock, another young woman got her arm shot off at Standing Rock. How about the fact that Occupy was undermined and destroyed and really never allowed to be resurrected under Obama? Or the fusion centers where the intelligence community works with local governments to illegally spy on protesters, when we have 8 to 10 protesters either missing or dead from Ferguson, which also happened under Obama, but nobody knows about it. Once again, it comes back to what we're allowed to, or who we're allowed to fight. And when we're seeing the censorship at the level that we are seeing it, where Twitter is not banning the information from the New York Post about Hunter and Joe Biden's corruption in the Ukraine because they found that there's proof 100% that it is false information, but because at the time they didn't have 100% proof that it wasn't false, then you are heading towards a very slippery slope. And I may not like Trump, but the difference between Trump and Obama in this particular case is I'm allowed to critique Trump. I'm allowed to criticize Trump, and I may even be elevated for it. But if you criticize Biden, just criticize him, then you could be banned off of a social media platform. And so you're talking about someone who has the entire neoliberal establishment, the neoconservative establishment with people like the Lincoln Project and the Transitional Integrity Project behind him. He's at a time where we're screaming, defund the police. He says, well, actually, instead, should we nominate a cop and then give them more money? At a time where progressives and anybody really who even says, I agree with the Republican, is being smeared and hung and lynched damn near on social media, he's vetting the worst neocons that I can remember since I've been alive. Because he knows he can get away with it. And people like Ben and others will vote for him anyway. And then pretend as if there's any way that we can substantively move him when he has shown that not only can we not substantively move him to the left if he wins, but even with all of it on the line as we speak, he not only will he not move to the left, he'll move to the right. He's moving to the right. I will not ban fracking. Biden's words. I will not. My plan is not the Green New Deal. Biden's words. I don't feel bad for the 94 crime bill. It was actually just the state's fault, even though the bill, if you read it, clearly put the onus on the states to do whatever they can to put people in jail to get people paid. That is Joe Biden.
That's
Joe Biden,
5 minutes.
5 minutes? Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so I'm just going to open it up now. Maybe give Ben a minute or two just to respond to maybe a couple of those, but then it's going to be just open forum. The two of you can go back and forth. And yeah, as long as things don't just turn into a screaming match, I don't think I'll need to jump in at all. So, have at it, gentlemen.
Go ahead, Ben.
Sure. So I agree as far as the criticisms of Biden go, and the criticisms Twitter go. I think I agree with just about everything that I heard. Right, I think that in the first couple sentences of my opening, I think I made it clear that I agree with all of that. So I think the question is, where do we come apart on this? And I think it's on two issues. Right, one of them is the criticism issue that you were talking about, the degree of tolerance by the neoliberal and neoconservative establishments for criticizing whoever is in office, and the other one is the leverage issue. So just to take those really quickly, one at a time, I think it's true, right? I absolutely do not believe. I think I said this in the opening statement that Biden can be pushed to the left. So I think that to my mind, the whole leverage thing is almost a non sequitur. I think that if we vote for Biden in swing states, which is where our votes matter the most, then I don't think that we have any leverage over him. But I also don't think that withholding those votes is a good way to get leverage. I think we've tried that strategy before and it didn't work. Millions of people voted for Ralph Nader in the year 2000, including many times the alleged gap between Gore and Bush in the state of Florida, and not only did that not lead to the Democrats saying, "Ooh, we lost some votes to our left," then we better move to the left next time. Next time they dominated John Kerry and Joe Lieberman. There were several states in 2016 where the Jill Stein vote was bigger than the gap between Trump and Biden. Certainly Michigan, where I live, where Trump beat Clinton by 0.23% of the vote. But not only did that not lead to the Democrats moving left, we got the most right-wing major candidate in the Democratic primary. So I think the idea that a couple percentage points of leftists withholding their votes is going to be some sort of way of exercising leverage. So if we don't do that, we're giving up leverage. I just don't know what that's empirically based on. I don't think we're going to have leverage one way or the other. I think that our strategy can't be about thinking about, okay, how is it that we're going we're going to pressure centrist Democrats into becoming leftists, because I think that's just not going to happen. Our strategy should be about how can we build up something better, and are we going to have an easier time if we still have some public sector unions, for example, still existing in 4 years or 8 years, or if that's not the case. I also really want to get into this issue about room to criticize, but we are in the open back and forth, and I've been talking for a while, so why don't I put it over to Niko?
So what it seems to me is that you're advocating for, like, everybody give up your integrity, even though you have zero room or ability to change anything Biden is doing, which in and of itself is kind of a weird argument. But I would say that this, I guess the problem, because I agree largely with what you're saying, but the problem is that we're having a debate right now about whether or not to vote with Biden, instead of us having a conference call right now on how to organize to shore up election integrity, because that's a major issue, which, by the way, all of a sudden became an issue because during the entire Democratic primaries, we saw exit poll after exit poll, after wrong ballots being given out, after voter suppression in communities of color and young communities. Like, no one wanted to acknowledge the realities of election fraud. But now that one party can use it against the other, or vice versa, everyone wants to pretend like they acknowledge it. But yet we're not having any serious conversations about election fraud. That's something that we could be doing instead of voting for Biden or giving away our leverage. We could be, and also, of course, making sure we never get to the point where we have a Joe Biden versus a Donald Trump. That's a major reason that we have these two, is because we refuse to address election fraud. When we have ballot, or when we could introduce and work on introducing and organizing for ballot initiatives in different states where you can get ranked choice voting, open source blockchain software, et cetera, et cetera. Florida, they organized to allow felons to vote. This is in 2018. Though that type of organizing is where all of our energy should be right now, if you consider yourself a progressive or a populist leftist. But instead, once again, we're having a debate about whether or not we should be voting for Biden in swing states, even though you yourself seems to concede that you agree it doesn't matter. Like, that's basically what you're telling me. Outside of,
not all what I'm telling you.
But other than you're like, oh, well, if Trump breaks down, unions have been consistently breaking down, and this is before Obama. I'm not going to blame it all on Obama. Obviously through Reagan, then Bush, then Clinton, then Obama, and now it's just a continuation of what we have seen. So unions to this point are so weak now that we're literally in the middle of a pandemic, and the little bit of strength they have is nowhere near enough to get us anything that is meaningful for the labor force as it is. So why not spend our time and energy organizing for that instead of pretending as if this election is going to yield some tangible gains for the working class in this country?
Okay, first of all, I don't think it's going to yield gains. I don't think that's on the ballot. I think what it can do, though, is preserve some of what little is left of what's been gained before against really unprecedented assaults. Now, it's absolutely true the union movement has been declining for decades and decades, no doubt about that. But that doesn't mean that the differences between the kinds of rulings that Obama's National Labor Relations Board were making and the kind of ruling that Trump's National Labor Relations Board are making don't matter. There's a reason. There was a New York Times article about this last week about Trump cabinet members racing in advance of January 20th, when they think their guy is probably going to be out of office, to make all sorts of regulatory changes. And the kinds of regulatory changes they're trying to make are all things like making it easier to reclassify workers as independent contractors, so you don't have to bargain with them. In many ways, there's a really good article about this by Paul Prescott and Jacobin I would encourage everybody to check out. In many ways, that Trump's NLRB has turned back the clock on labor law to the most anti-worker it's been since the 1930s. And I don't think we should say, well, we've been losing the war anyway, so it doesn't matter if these really disturbing new things are happening to roll it back. That will be a difference. That is something we have control over. Unfortunately, the left doesn't have any control over election integrity. You can do things like, volunteer for poll monitoring groups.
How do we not
but
have
for
any
the
control over that?
but for the next 2 weeks, right? There's not a lot we can do that's going to do that. Now, what little we can do, like I said, volunteering for those election protection sorts of efforts, I absolutely think, sure, we could do that. I think we could also walk and chew bubblegum, right? You can also spend 5 minutes filling out a ballot, which there are other things there that you probably want to do anyway in terms of ballot resolutions, etc. And while you're doing it at the top of the ballot, make this defensive maneuver to stop Trump's appointees to the National Labor Relations Board from ravaging what's left of organized labor. I think you can do that and also focus on these election integrity issues. And I just do want to go back to one of the first things you said in this part, right? Which is you talked about we're being asked to, earlier you said that, we're being asked to sacrifice our leverage, but then it seemed like you agreed that we really don't have very much leverage either way. Then you said we're being asked to sacrifice our integrity. I just want to make clear, those are two very different arguments, right? So one is a tactical argument that by withholding a couple percentage of the vote, that's the sort of vote we're talking about, votes from committed leftists, then we can exercise some sort of leverage of the Democratic Party. I don't think that strategy has worked before. The other question is, okay, maybe we don't have any leverage one way or the other, which I think is the unfortunate reality of it. The outcome of the election matters because the difference between Democratic and Republican appointees to the National Labor Relations Board matter. But that doesn't. But in terms of pushing a Biden administration to the left, that's not going to have to be the Lincoln Project's administration, not ours. You're 100% right about that. But then your other argument was about integrity. You said we're giving up our integrity. That's not a tactical argument. That's a principled argument. And I guess I would question what the principle is there, because it seems to me that if you're in some scenario, like you're in a horror movie and Jigsaw or somebody says, you have a choice between these two rooms that you can, open up this door, and something's going to try to kill you in each one. You could say, nope, I have integrity, I'm not going to choose. Or you could say, I want to open up the door where I think me and my friends have a better chance of surviving. And I think that would be the right call here. And I think that would also be the right call when it comes to what the left should do in swing states.
So I want to address this idea that somehow allowing Biden to become president is somehow going to shore up labor unions or the labor force in general, or even just preserve it. I don't want to put words in my mouth, so let's just say preserve it. There's literally nothing, no findings that support that at all. You're talking about like a man who vehemently supports NAFTA, still supports it, did support TPP before it was broken up, has a history of just being union in name only. I mean, we can just look at this article from The Guardian where it said at no point in his career has Biden proven to be willing to take the slightest political risk on behalf of workers. His appearances in union halls occur when he needs something from labor. On the other hand, when Biden went to vacation in the Hamptons during 2011 Verizon strike, workers in the area sought him out to possibly get a show of support, a thumbs up, a head nod, anything, to no avail. The same year in Wisconsin, labor leaders specifically asked Biden to come to a rally to rally their resistance to the brutal, ultimately successful attack by Scott Walker, and Biden declined. In other words, Biden is not only reliable when it comes to preserving labor, but he's actually abysmal on the issue. And the areas where he's had the power to do anything about it to help labor, he's done the opposite. As VP, he says the bailout, he takes a lot of credit for that bailout, where he literally bailed out Wall Street instead of Main Street. He bailed out the auto industry, but did little to nothing to help bail out the auto workers. He's a lot of the reasons that a lot of these jobs are not here anymore. And let's not forget, this is also not just about Biden, of course. This is about Kamala, because Biden has made it clear that the person who comes in as VP needs to be ready by day one, because he has no anticipation of being a two-term president. And so now we have to worry about consequences not only next year, but 4, 8, 12 years down the line. So you're really giving up your leverage potentially for 3 administrations, because if she starts day one after 2 years, she can run again twice. And this is a candidate who was wildly unpopular. We already know what both of them have done to communities of color. We already know what both of them have done to Black communities specifically. We already know, like, I understand what you're referring to about labor, and like that's a big deal. Like, don't get it twisted. I agree with you, but I'm also worried about like the life of myself and the people who look like me. And there is in none of your arguments, by the way, I've just heard zero reassurance about this key issue, and this is an issue that I've seen ignored by quote unquote socialists who care about quote unquote labor on a regular basis. I'm glad that we're worried about labor, but I'm also worried about deaths. And when you're talking about a man who said we want to give $300 million more to cops for better training without ever questioning whether or not they even want to be trained, without even bringing up the fact that Breonna Taylor, in that case, the attorney general lied and said that the jury agreed that the cops shouldn't be prosecuted. And it came out, a jury member came out in a New York Times story, said that's a lie. We never even had the option to prosecute those two officers. And Joe Biden has said nothing about it, where he tries to purport this idea that Antifa is an idea, but not an organization, because he doesn't want people organized. Antifa is it's not an idea. It is an organization where people didn't wear masks. And this originated with Mussolini, because I know there's a bunch of Black leaders who found they were placed in the leadership of Antifa in Italy and in Germany. It's where the Black Fist comes from. What we should be doing, instead of giving up our leverage by using one candidate's name or another, is do like what Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Huey P. Newton, back in the day, Angela Davis, Fred Hampton, all these great activists did something that the left seems to not be able to bring themselves to do anymore, which is maybe we should just tell everybody we're going to challenge them instead of telling the world who we are and aren't going to vote for before we've even gotten any concessions whatsoever. And I think that is the part that is kind of missing out of here. Is people don't really realize how we've had any success, the little bit of success the left has had in this country. How have we had any success in the past? How did the civil rights legislation get passed? Because Martin Luther King sat down with JFK, even though they disliked each other, because RFK related to MLK as an activist, of course, and then of course he was JFK's brother, and he forced them to sit down. But that was after Martin Luther King had every bit of leverage he had. And still you wouldn't know who he was going to vote for if JFK ever got to run again. Like you just never know. And that's how the left in its best organizing years have gotten the most done.
Yeah, so I want to go back to the very first thing you said about Biden's terrible record on labor, all of which I agree with, but let's be really clear about why I think this matters in terms of preserving what's left of the labor movement. It's not because I think that Biden is going to do a 180 and stop supporting the kind of corporatist trade deals that he's always supported. I don't. It's not because I think that there's some great reform that he's going to start supporting. I don't. Again, I think that the idea that these things will happen either just because we're voting for him, or that these things will happen in some future Democratic administration because we exercise this supposed leverage by not voting for him. I don't think there's a lot of historical evidence for either of those. I would point out with regard to the Civil Rights Act that if JFK had stayed president, there might very well not be the meaningful Civil Rights Act, that actually happened in 1964. Because that was really pushed through by Lyndon Johnson after an election, by the way, where Martin Luther King, who was the most successful of those leaders that you just mentioned, strongly supported Johnson against Goldwater, despite Johnson's terrible previous record on civil rights. But the reason that I think that it matters as far as labor is this very specific issue, which is whether Democrats or Republicans are going to be appointed to the courts and to the National Labor Relations Board. And I think that Biden would do what Obama did, which is to say, mostly appoint mediocre Democrats to those things rather than Republicans, which means having a whole bunch of precedents that were just reversed by the Trump administration when it comes to stuff like whether the union is allowed to use public places as an employer, like the area outside of a grocery store that the Salvation Army might set up in to pass out information, reversed by Trump's National Labor Relations Board, who can file grievances, and then that's not even getting in to the really scary stuff like the COVID era rulings about how exposing the terrifying working conditions, which, by the way, disproportionately affect people of color, faced by essential workers, how that's not protected speech, the use of COVID as an excuse to cancel union elections. And I think that expecting Biden to be not a bit better than Obama, which is what I expect, it's still the case that under Obama, you had appointees to these things who did not rule in the kinds of extreme anti-union ways as Trump's appointees to these things, because the Democratic Party's structural relation to unions is different. It screws them over in many, many ways, no doubt about it. But it's part of the deal whereby it continues to be supported by them, is about not screwing them over in this way. Now, could there be, how about that issue that you raised? And I think it's important and it's good, right? You know, that you raised this issue about militarized policing, about the mass incarceration state, where of course Biden's record has been absolutely terrible. But the question on the table, at least as I see it, is not Biden good or Biden bad. If that was the question, we'd be on the same side and it'd be a very short debate. The question is, are there any areas in which it would be better for us if Trump won rather than Biden won? I certainly don't see any reason to think that mass incarceration and militarized policing would be one of those areas, especially considering that we're talking about the president, Trump, who has done things like send the Department of Homeland Security to anti-police brutality protests, to shove protesters into unmarked vans, who's done things like speak to groups of police officers to urge them to be less gentle when arresting people, who's done things like using the military to clear out crowds of anti-police brutality protesters. So are there any areas like this in which it would be better if Trump won than Biden won? If not, what we're left with are areas in which it would either be neutral, right? That it would be equally bad if Trump won or Biden won, or areas where it would not be quite as bad for us if Biden won than if Trump won. Now, my contention is that there are lots of areas that you can find, I don't doubt this, where it would be pretty neutral. It would be about the same under Trump or Biden. But if it's also true that there are areas that are important to us where if Trump is reelected, it's going to be significantly worse than if Biden is elected. I think that this National Labor Relations Board one is one of them. It's not talked about nearly enough. It's absolutely strategically crucial for the future of the left. I think that the post office and Trump's floating of plans to privatize the post office is very important. I think, by the way, if we want to talk about racial justice issues, which we should, I think that the institution of the post office and the institution of labor unions have been among the major drivers of Black upward mobility in the 20th century, and so I think that's important. But I also think, and this is the last point, and I'll
I was just going to butt in right after this.
So I also think that when we're talking about those people who have been most failed by the status quo, the people who have been most brutalized by the status quo, in other words, Black and brown communities of color, right? The people who have been, at least domestically, at least in the United States. We can talk about foreign policy. I'm not convinced that there's any way in which a Trump victory would be preferable to a Biden victory there. But at least within the United States, those people and how we can do right by them, then I think the question can't be what's the best strategy for pressuring Biden, because I think that's a non-starter, which I think we actually might agree on. I think the question has to be, how can we build something better? How can we build a successful left that can actually beat centrists in primaries and can win general elections and could ultimately win socialism, because that's what really matters as far as doing right by those people. And I think that when it comes to that, I do think that our strategy for that, what's strategically important for fulfilling that objective, does run through having an organized working class. So not just for the sake of day-to-day bread and butter issues in the workplace, but also for the sake of everything else that we care about as the left. If that is the most crucial way, at least strategically, we can also talk about harm reduction and technocratic management of the COVID crisis. But if that's the most strategically vital way that there's a difference, then I think for the sake of all of the issues that you're talking about, we should preserve what we have by making a defensive vote in swing states.
Okay,
right, so
okay, just 1 sec. Why don't I give, because we've already reached the 20 minutes here, why don't I give Niko like 3 or 4 minutes just to address all the points you brought up there, Ben, and then I'll give you maybe 1 minute, Ben, to answer back, at which point I want to open it up to the audience questions.
Then we'll go to Q&A.
Yeah, yep. Okay, all right. So let's do that, Niko.
Fair enough.
So I want to address this point where you said, well, at least Biden will nominate mediocre Democrats. And there's zero proof that that's actually like what he'll do. Not even like in large numbers, but even in kind of medium numbers. Like this is the same man who excoriated Anita Hill to protect Clarence Thomas. This is the same man who brags about, I'm the reason that the Patriot Act got introduced. I'm the one who designed the Patriot Act, which he worked with Brett Kavanaugh to basically learn how to legally undermine the Constitution, quote unquote, to get passed and introduced. Like the man bragged the entire primary, I'll work with Republicans, which seem to only be in situations where he screws the working class or specifically is screwing black people. Like the man has made it very clear, even as of a couple of days ago, he's not only willing to work with Republicans, but he's willing to work with the worst Republicans that we know. And it, once again, it's not just that he's willing to do it, but that he would be willing to do it. And we know that it would go by in silence. And the left, especially the neoliberal, the neo-progressive left, whether it be in Congress or outside of it, will gaslight and just say, oh, well, the Republicans will be worse, except for basically Joe Biden is a Republican, has had a substantial history of working with those same Republicans. Now, there's also the reality that mediocre Democrats are damn near just as bad as Republicans. We can look no further than Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who worked to make sure, or who allowed, or put out a ruling, I should say, that resulted in indigenous people being displaced so a pipeline could be built through. Like, worked to make sure that the police state could run license plates in a case where specifically a black man was having his license plates run illegitimately, but because of her recent ruling before she passed away, now cops can run license plates without any reason whatsoever, which primarily affects people of color and specifically black people. When we're talking about like what Joe Biden is, there seems to be this breakdown in communication about like the Democrat versus Republican thing. Like we just keep ignoring the fact that Joe Biden is literally Republican. It was not just several months ago where leftists swore on the Bible of socialism that they would never even think about voting for Joe Biden because he was in fact the neoconservative Republican in Democratic skin. Like that's what he painted himself as. And he was bragging about this, like I said, a lot during the primary. So we can't really lose track of the fact that Joe Biden has shown no proof whatsoever that he would nominate even decent Democrats, let alone not nominating Republicans. Now, I want to go back to the USPS point just really quick. The USPS has been consistently under attack for literally multiple terms, right? Just like the Small Business Administration. Every single administration has chipped away at the USPS, and the postmaster himself said that this didn't start with Trump and it's not even speeding up under Trump. It is just consistently getting worse, but there's more attention being brought to it because it's being directly linked to election fraud by Democrats. And the Democrats are looking for every reason to say that the election is going to be stolen from them, just like the Republicans want to harp on ballot harvesting as if they didn't just get found guilty of that in North Carolina and just got caught doing it in California. Both of them will use whatever tactics they have to ignore the history of them both equally participating in the denigration of democracy. Now, I also want to say that
we got about like 30 seconds.
Yeah, so a lot of the policing issues that you brought up also happened under Obama. And of course, I know they happened under Trump, but we got to remember a lot of them have started because of Joe Biden. Like, I don't know why we keep pretending like this isn't a thing. Like, yeah, the things that happened under Obama and Trump have equally been horrid. But once again, you know about all of them now. Everybody's organizing once again because everybody hates the ugly fascism, but they prefer the civility fascism. But I remember everything that happened under under Obama, and I remember how most people never organized, whereas now the whole country is organizing to stop Trump. And then, of course, I do believe that there is something to be said that one presidential candidate literally said he basically wants to go to war with Russia and or China, whereas Trump has at least taken us out of Afghanistan and hasn't started any new wars, unlike the administration that Biden was in that started 5 new wars, brought us to 7.
Okay, Ben,
Okay.
do you think you can keep this
Give
under a
my
minute?
minute. All right,
Yeah.
I'm gonna try like hell. All right. I never swore on the Bible of socialism that I wouldn't vote for a centrist if what won. In fact, you can go back and look at stuff that I was writing a year ago. I always said that I'd have this position. This is my position. Might be wrong, but at least it's consistent. The reason that we have to think that Biden would mostly appoint mediocre Democrats to the National Labor Relations Board is that's what Barack Obama did, and that's what Bill Clinton did. Everything that you're saying about Biden working with Republicans on many things, voting for bad Republicans, being willing to appoint Republicans to his cabinet, that's also true. Just like it was also true about Bill Clinton, it was also true about Barack Obama. But they all appointed people to the National Labor Relations Board of the courts who made very different rulings. It's not at all true that Ruth Bader Ginsburg was equivalent to a conservative Supreme Court justice. Look at the position she took about Janus. Look at the positions she took about reproductive rights. Look at the positions that she's taken on a number of issues. You don't have to convince me that they're terrible, disgusting rulings that she made, but that's not the question. The question is, what's the difference, and how does that difference matter to us strategically? And to be convinced that I was wrong about that, I would have to be shown that there are no ways in which they're going to be different that are of strategic interest to us, and I certainly haven't heard that.
Okay, first, thank you so much, both of you, to being so responsible and professional during this. There's been just no yelling. Y'all are great. I've got a lot of questions from the audience, so I'm just going to start directing them either to both of you, but some of them are very specifically towards each of you. If you could try and keep the answers under a 2-minute mark, I'll just maybe give you a warning if they're rolling higher than that. So this first one is to you, Niko. Do you know that Tulsi Gabbard is supporting Joe Biden, and what do you think about that?
Yeah, I was one of the first people she told. Tulsi Gabbard signed a contract and said she was going to support Joe Biden. I don't know if she knows for sure what plans she has going forward, but if she would have not honored that contract, then she may have been disallowed from running again for president, which I'm sure she probably will run twice because most people do. And then by the time she finished, by the time the court ruling was put up, they would be more than halfway through the primary. She'd have no chance to win. So I'm pretty sure that had a lot to do with her decision. As far as myself is concerned, I'm a Tulsi Gabbard surrogate, and I'm actually the only surrogate for any of the campaigns that was allowed to criticize and disagree openly with my candidate, despite popular belief. I was the only one allowed to do that. And so she's fully aware of what my position is. She knew that actually before I became one of her surrogates. And that's one of the reasons that I had so much respect for her, is because even in our disagreements, we coalesce on the issues no matter what, like election integrity, like the all fossil fuels act she introduced, and foreign policy, of course. So yeah, there you
go. To Mr. Ben Burgis, how can you support someone like Joe Biden when a lot of the things that he put in place, including the 1994 crime bill, are what contributed to the current state of the United States that we find ourselves in today, that is directly related to the reason that Donald Trump got elected in the first place?
Well, I totally agree with the assessment of Biden's background, and I totally agree that the evils of that kind of neoliberal democratic centrism are a big part of how we got Trump in the first place, which is why I absolutely don't think that making that tactical defensive decision that I'm advocating is any sort of solution to that problem. You're right. At best, it just resets us where we started, and if we don't build something better, then we're going to end up in the same place again. With Tom Cotton as president, or something like that. Right? They can always come up with even worse, even scarier Republicans. So I don't think that it's not about supporting Biden in the sense of liking him, of thinking, oh, I'm gonna give him the honor of my vote. The question is the equivalent of, do I want somebody to run after me waving a knife, or do I want somebody to run after me shooting a gun? Yeah, I know about the knife, but I would still prefer the knife scenario to the gun scenario. And ultimately, what it does is it gives us a little bit of breathing room with which we can build something better.
Okay, thank you very much. To Niko, say in your scenario, Trump wins, then what?
Well, my scenario, I would do the same thing I'm doing now. I'm an election integrity advocate. This is something that I do on the ground. I'm an activist on the ground. My team that I built is right now to this. I mean, I think they just went to a protest last night, and they're going to another one, and they cover what happens with police brutality in real time. They've been arrested just a couple of weeks ago. Also, We're in the process of creating a masterclass, virtual online class to start worker-owned co-ops. We're going to try to be the first media network that is worker-owned completely. And we want to teach other people how to build a progressive economy through worker-owned co-ops, because as we've seen, some of the most successful businesses and profitable, if to be honest, have been like legitimately profitable, not like fake profits like stock market, but they have been worker-owned co-ops. And so once again, this is and of course I just, do what I do as far as the news is concerned, but this is not a fight for me that started or stopped with the election. I was an activist before I got into media. I was an activist while I was at UNC, and I was an organizer and an activist after that. And that's not going to stop anytime soon. But the difference is, once again, it's a lot easier to organize and activate against Trump because everybody knows how bad he is. But once again, under Biden, just as we saw on Twitter, criticism of Biden or his son or his family or his corrupt dealings will not be tolerated. And in fact, in situations like with Twitter, they'll lie. I'm a big foreign policy advocate. I pay a lot of attention to foreign policy. And Twitter lied and said that he never fired the prosecutor for investigating his son, except for he bragged about it at a CFR meeting, that he in fact did brag about, that he in fact did fire the prosecutor for investigating his son, and he did threaten to withhold $1 billion. And I would love to be able to criticize things like that and organize against things like that with people like Code Pink and others, to make sure that not only can Trump not get away with things like this again, but neither can anyone who gets elected in the future.
Can I jump in for 30 seconds on part of what he just said?
Sure, as long as it's 30 seconds, I'll time it.
Okay. Yeah. I think this idea that you can organize against Trump in a way that you can't organize against a centrist Democrat, I think it doesn't bear out historically. Black Lives Matter started under Obama. Occupy Wall Street started under Obama. Bernie Sanders won 22 states while Obama was president. If anything, I think oftentimes the opposite happens, which is that with a flashy, ostentatiously evil Republican like Donald Trump or George W. Bush, a lot of dissident anti-establishment energy gets focused on them as an individual and people being opposed to them as an individual, whereas with a figure like Obama or Biden as president, oftentimes that energy gets channeled against the system because it's less easy to blame it on the individual at the top of that system.
Okay, do you want like a minute to respond to that?
Yeah. So Black Lives Matter got co-opted into a 501c4 organization that is now fundraising millions of dollars for Joe Biden's campaign. The very man who created the 94 crime bill, and really is a lot of the reason why we had BLM to begin with. Occupy was utterly destroyed by Obama, and they went away damn near silently into the night because nobody wants to challenge Obama as an individual. There's this false dichotomy that we have to have, that we can organize, but and it's easier to organize because they can't blame it on a person, or we can hold that person accountable. So simultaneously organizing and make sure that when we do have to call out that person, like what he did in Flint, where he fake drank water, or what he allowed to happen in Standing Rock, or what he allowed to happen in Baltimore, Ferguson. Like, we want to make sure that those criticisms are heard by, of course, his own party, which you just said, it's easier to do it to Trump, where he can be held accountable. But now we see organizing efforts against, for example, the kids being put in cages, which we had never seen under Obama. And once again, by the way, Biden is still defending this, but that's just one example of the many examples of how we can organize and fight, but also we need the ability to hold the people to account that should be held to account without being silenced for it.
This next question is going to kind of be related to that, Ben, so it might be a way if you want to keep talking about this topic. But one of the questions towards you is that, yes, Black Lives Matter started under Obama, but at that time it was heavily suppressed and seen as a negative movement, whereas now it is seen as something that is universally accepted. Do you think that was possible under the Obama administration versus what it has become under Trump's?
Okay, so first of all, the idea that that BLM, which sure sometimes refers to this very specific thing, this nonprofit, sometimes it refers to this very broad movement against police violence. But the idea that in any version of it that's met universal acceptance right now, I don't think is quite living in the real world. I think if you look at the polls, actually since the summer, support has unfortunately really dropped off. And I think that it's not. And I mean, look, there was a point when Trump and Cotton were talking about sending in the military, there were polls where over 50% of the public supported that, unfortunately, right? On this issue, we have our work cut out for us. So I think this idea that like, oh, sure, it existed then, but everybody supports it now, I think is really wrong. And of course, what the questioner says, what Niko said about how a lot of these movements were either politically co-opted or they were crushed by police repression or some combination of the two. All of that, of course, is true, but I don't really think that's relevant to the main point, which is that if you're going to argue that there's going to be less opposition, fewer openings for the left under a centrist Democrat than there will be under a right-wing Republican, then the fact that these movements got started at all under Obama, that's when they happened, I think really undermines that claim. I think it's really evidence against it. I think actually the left is generally better off. I mean, not that I would put too much weight on this. I think that if we're primarily thinking about, I don't think we should primarily think about, okay, are we going to have slightly more political openings under this one and under this one? How's this group of people going to think about this president or that president? I think we should keep our eye on the ball and think about those NLRB rulings. But I was just going to say, I think that there is actually a lot of evidence that under bad Democrats going from SDS in the Johnson administration to Occupy and the Bernie movement under Obama, very often that's actually the most favorable terrain for the left, because instead of everything getting clumped together to oppose this right-wing Republican, there's more room for differentiation between liberals and the left.
Let's take a second.
Yeah, of course, please.
Okay, so he had a really bad Democrat in Bill Clinton, who, by the way, ran on being right to the right of George H.W. on crime, but we had a really bad Democrat. The next guy, I think we remember how that turned out. Millions of Iraqis and Afghanis dead now. And then, of course, we got Obama, who ran on being real. Actually, people don't give Obama enough credit for how deceitful he was during that campaign. But you are right about one thing. It was organizing under Obama because people started getting more and more and more pissed. But they were, once again, not really allowed. Obama was very rarely put in a position where he had to face those criticisms and take that challenge. And in fact, a lot of times he used it as an opportunity to co-opt it. And then, like, for example, use the CFPB as a Trojan horse to help implement Dodd-Frank, which made the banks even bigger. Of course, we know that he also used it like with Occupy Wall Street. It was really birthed out of bailing out Wall Street instead of quote unquote Main Street. And then because of how bad he was, I know we talk about the Bernie movement, but then look what happened. We got Donald goddamn Trump right after that. And then, of course, because we didn't want to talk about election fraud or address what happened to Bernie Sanders, and Bernie Sanders himself didn't want to address what happened to it. Now we're back at a situation where we have somebody who's potentially, I don't know if you consider him worse than Bill Clinton, but he's at the very bare minimum way more willing to work with Republicans than Bill Clinton was. And then you have, of course, the Kamala Harris factor, where Republicans, I think they hate Kamala more than they hate Biden. And you have to deal with the fact that with that Bernie movement, there was a huge splintering of that movement where a lot of those Bernie supporters went right to Trump because they felt like they were being unaddressed. They felt like they were being unheard. Like, that's reality. And so we got Trump right now. So we get Biden, who is arguably worse than Bill Clinton. And he's definitely worse than Obama, I would say. Like, who do we get next, bro? Like, who are we going to get if Biden is allowed to get away with, or Kamala eventually is allowed to get away with some of the things that these other neoliberal presidents were able to get away with? I don't want to know that. I would rather, once again, we have a conversation in the future, Ben, about how we organize this labor movement, how we make sure we don't get candidates like Biden and Trump against each other again, and how we expand these parties to make these elections more conclusive.
Okay, just very quickly, Niko, because this is one of the last questions, and then I was going to move on pretty shortly to your closing statements. But this question to you, Niko, is yes, but is Joe Biden worse than Donald Trump?
Is Joe Biden worse than Donald Trump? Like I said, people ask me that all the time, and I just consider one a neo-fascist and one a civility fascist. It's just that one I'm allowed to criticize, and one I might get banned from Twitter or Facebook or YouTube or whatever from criticizing. One, if I criticize, I become a famous neo-progressive. The other, you might end up like Chris Pratt and be called a white supremacist if you don't show up at his fundraiser. One has the tech industry protecting him. The other one has the tech industry literally adding context to Twitter trends in order to basically commit a narrative siege. That's exactly what it looks like if you've been reading them. And for me, I would rather, have the person in power that I can actually fight without getting, just dragged to the ground for doing and having my career ended. Like which you're seeing right now with Chris Pratt, despite the fact that Robert Downey Jr. also didn't go to that fundraiser, which is a different discussion. But I don't think it's a matter of like what Ben said. I think we both agree it's not a matter of who's worse, but more so a matter of who we can fight. And it seems pretty clear to me who we actually are allowed to fight. And that would be Donald Trump.
All right. Do you guys want to give your closing statements? I'll start with you, Ben. 5 minutes.
Sure. So the argument that I made in the beginning was that even though both of these people are our enemies, it matters strategically, even beyond harm reduction and issues like technocratic management of the COVID crisis. It matters strategically which one of these enemies that we fight for the next 4 years and about which issues. My main argument from the beginning has been that if you compare Obama's appointees, the National Labor Relations Board and the courts, to Trump's appointees to the National Labor Relations Board and the courts, if you look at all the Obama-era precedents that Trump's NLRB reversed, always to make things harder for workers and easier for bosses, then there does seem to be a fairly significant difference there. And what I want you to keep your eye on is that nothing that we've heard, right? I've heard a lot from Niko about the importance of election integrity, which I agree with. I've heard a lot from Niko about the importance of worker co-ops, which I really agree with, and you should go support what he's talking about there. I've heard a lot from Niko about all of the many, many terrible things that Biden is doing, which if I were debating a centrist about whether Biden good, Biden bad, I would probably bring up most of the same things. But if we're concerned about our ability to fight, I think what matters is not how is Twitter going to react, how are neoliberals and neoconservatives, what their takes are going to be like about the piddling, nonsensical tempest in a teapot about the Chris Pratt thing. I don't care about any of those people. What we should care about are institutional things like is the Department of Homeland Security going to be sent to Portland to shove protesters in an unmarked van? And in particular, as socialists, what we should care about is our ability to build a workers' movement that can fight for something better. And what I have not heard from Niko at any point is any reason to think that Biden wouldn't do with regard to the National Labor Relations Board of the courts what Obama did and what, for that matter, Bill Clinton did. Bill Clinton was, I think, maybe a little worse than Niko's remembering. He did.
I was only like 3 or 4 years old, so forgive me a bit.
Okay. That's fair enough. I am very old. So maybe those disgusting memories are slightly fresher because at least I was a teenager. But Bill Clinton appointed William Cohen, a Republican, as his Secretary of Defense. But Clinton basically appointed Democrats to the NLRB. Obama basically, for the most part, appointed Democrats to the NLRB. And I think that I haven't heard anything that resembles a reason to think that Biden wouldn't do the same thing. Whereas we know that Trump is going to appoint to the NLRB and the courts people whose mission in life, what makes them get up in the morning, what motivates them throughout the day is to stamp out what's left of the labor movement and what's left of collective bargaining in American workplaces. If we care not about pressuring one or the other of our enemies to be a little bit better, if we care not about how people will react on Twitter or in editorial pages to what we're doing, hey, if we're succeeding, those people are going to hate us no matter who's president. What we should care about is our ability to organize the working class, to build a better alternative and bring about something better. And from that perspective, this NLRB thing, it's not sexy, but it does matter. And so the one thing that we actually can control, looking at all the states in the past where there have been third-party vote counts that have been higher than the difference between the Democrats and Republicans, the one thing that we can control is who's elected and hence who's going to be appointed to these things, and hence what our chances are of maintaining some kind of workers' movement that can fight to live another day. And I think from that perspective, it's clear which enemy we should pick in a couple of weeks when we vote.
Well, first I want to say, Ben, I sincerely appreciate the debate. It was a fantastic conversation. Once again, one of my favorite debates, and debating you has been one of my favorite. I've debated a lot of leftists. You've been the most coherent and definitely have been the most professional and polite. So I appreciate that. So I do want to say that this idea somehow that consent, the manufacturing of that consent, is all of a sudden just not important. Doesn't make any sense, as we're, of course, in an era right now where the neoliberals love to prop up Chomsky, excuse me. They love to prop up Chomsky every 4 years to get him to manufacture consent, ironically enough. But Chomsky and his co-author wrote about manufacturing consent for a reason. What the big tech industries are doing are literally manufacturing consent, and they have the institutional power. And clearly the institutions, our governmental institutions, are allowing them to do it to one degree or another. And we can't really do anything about that. It's weird that like this being codified as, oh, it's just a bunch of banter on Twitter. It doesn't just it's not limited to Twitter. If it was just a bunch of banter on Twitter, I doubt we would be as invested in Twitter, in these publications, in news articles, in Facebook. 50% of all articles are read on Facebook now. Like, it matters. There's a reason that millions in campaign funds are paid to promote candidates or causes or institutions on Twitter. That's why the Lincoln Project is so invested in Twitter. That's why Kamala always dancing for Twitter. That's why Twitter blocked the article about Hunter Biden to begin with, because it isn't just Twitter. We know we can control the narrative, and that narrative is what leads to fundraising for the causes that we support. That narrative is what leads to the leadership that comes out of these social media apparatuses, but for the causes that we support. And I don't think I can't accept this idea where we should pretend as if Twitter is just Twitter, it doesn't matter, or Facebook is Facebook, it just doesn't matter. Like, yeah, it's not real life, but people in real life spend a lot of money to control the narrative on these platforms, and they should be taken seriously whenever we see how neoliberals have taken these platforms and basically use them as bastions for their brand to then co-opt and convert over into votes or fundraising for one party, or another, or one candidate or another. As far as what Trump has done and what Biden might do and what Obama has done, I do think it should be clarified. Obama definitely allowed the National Guard to be sent to Ferguson. That happened. He told the governor to be wary, but that definitely happened. And even if he didn't, he definitely militarized them and their literal tanks in Ferguson. Like I said, the police department in North Dakota took people's eyes, took people's arms, despite the massive organizing effort there. By the way, that was killed by Obama. Surprisingly enough, was the negatives that all came about because of that. We thought it was over and done with. The courts actually sided with the Sioux Nation, and that pipeline, the North Dakota Access Pipeline, is not allowed to be there now. And that happened under Trump, which is weird. I'm not equating the two, but what I'm saying is sometimes it's better to fight. It's better to spend our energy, in our rhetoric, in our talents, fighting and organizing for causes, rather than pretending as if either of them are, Trump or Biden, are on our side. Like, I'm voting for Gloria La Riva, not because I think she has a chance to win, but because that is the person I want to work with when this is all said and done. Because she's, an organizer. I'm sure you're familiar with her already. I want to elevate conversations that actually drive the country forward, rather than elevating the conversations that keep the country stagnant. And that's what I feel like this is really a debate about. It's how do we spend our energy? Do we spend it on we spend our energy on Twitch breaking records to support Joe Biden? Or do we take those 400,000 users and organize a massive effort in election integrity that allow the Bolivian indigenous to commit a coup of a coup? That's what election integrity, that one issue allow, now let's not pretend like they're just going to disappear, but that one issue, allow Evo Morales to rest and say, you know what, don't worry about it. I know what the outcome is going to be because we worked so hard on this one issue. Maduro worked so hard on this one issue. Several countries, several socialist nations worked so hard on this one issue that they're confident that they can overthrow coups through elections. This is the type of stuff that we should be organizing around, rather than pretending as if the status quo is even something to think about, like maintaining. People are dying under the maintenance of the status quo. We should be aggressively pushing towards organization behind issues. And that should be it. I'm not saying that you can't support candidates, but like I said, the next time, Ben, I hope that we have a discussion like this. I truly do hope that it is in favor of issues and the best way to organize for those issues, rather than figuring out the next lesser of two evils that we should elect.
Gentlemen, thank you so much. I want to thank you both formally for being so respectful, polite, kind. I know it's not the kind of debates the internet craves, but it's the one they deserve. Or maybe it's the opposite. Maybe they don't deserve it. They deserve something terrible. Hey, we want to mutual aid you to get some eyeballs on your work. So if you have a leftist YouTube channel or Twitch stream or something you want us to advertise, just send us a 20 to 30 second ad using the forms at weareserfs.com. We'll do our best to help you out. And please submit once per channel.
To our God, I'm Rad. We pray at your altar of greatness. To our monarch, Tom Spiker, you are the light that guides our path. To our lords, Jimothy K. Meeblebeeps Jr., Ryan Lubin, Trevor R., Jeffrey Lamb, Poppy Nelson, Stephen, Hans Josephine, Nine Tails Cosmic Fox, we bow meekly for your pleasure. To our Knights of the Round Table, J. Fraser Cartwright, Thomas Brereton, Ali Menthal, Jimmy Bignuts, Good Poon Hates Cops, That's Solid Poon Then, Violent Orchard, Sophie Baby, Political Puppy, Andreas Chiringoito, Goofus Lankius, Zach Christensen, Nicholas Marks, Joppy, Josh Mickelson, Dr. Zayas, Dylan Byth, Todd Buckingham, and Todd Lajeunesse. We salute you.